So I guess I'll get started with, why should I listen to this guy? The reason you should listen to me is that we use data in order to grow from a 3-person startup in May 2010, where all of us were working from home. We were 2 devs and a PM at Blue Shell, and we took a very, very small seed round. It's sort of the indie dream, keeping with the theming of Casual Connect and its roots. When you start, you don't really know where you're going. You essentially have a couple ideas to make some great games, and you put it out there, and you hope you're going to get some traction in the marketplace. We got here because we kept a record of everything that we did. We studied it endlessly. We obsessed about it. It drove us nuts. It kept us up late at night. But here we are in 2014, and we have 35 employees all over the United States. We have 5 million monthly uniques, and we've been profitable since 2011, which I think is something that you could aspire to when you start out from the beginning. I figured just for a point of context, I included my desk in our first office. As you can see, there's nothing much there, and there's a guy building furniture in the back. So we're pretty scrappy. And we're bootstrapped, as I mentioned, really small seed round, so you don't have a lot of advantages at that point. And what you have to do is be very, very careful about the information that you keep and really delve into that for insights about your customers. So how does this work? How do you start from essentially so little and build up a company out of this, almost out of thin air? So here's what we did. We recorded everything. And why would you record everything? When you say everything, it's sort of a broad topic. What does that mean? It's almost hard to explain because it's somewhat so fundamental. Like every time a user takes any action in a game that you might make, you want to make sure that there's a record of it. And you record everything so that you can ask better questions. As your game grows and as your users are exploring your game, there's some base level metrics that you can get from hosting services like Mixpanel or Google Analytics or Contagion or those guys. But they're going to give you top level numbers, like how much did I make today? How many users do I have today? How many have returned from yesterday? But those are very surface level questions. So I'm going to talk about asking deeper questions, asking about who your customers are, what they like to do at an individual level or at a micro cohort level. You ask better questions so that you can ultimately make better decisions. There's nothing worse than essentially building the wrong feature. When you're a small company, it could take you 2 months to build something that you believe in. But if that supposition, if that inspiration to build that feature is not based on validated customer data, you don't know. You could have wasted like 2 months of your company's time and untold man hours just building something that your customers are never going to care about. And you make better decisions, you build better products. You build better products, you go from, I think we started with like 500 DAU, and we were up to 1.5 million DAU in late 2013. So, why would you record everything? Why not just study the metrics, the KPIs that everybody is looking for, which are, like I said, like raw revenue, DAU, repeat transactions? The reason is that you want to break down all of the information about your users into very granular chunks because it gives you another chance to understand who they are and what they might want to do and why they might give you $1 in order to buy something or some item or virtual currency in your game. Every type of data that you're going to store is going to give you another chance to make them happier, and that's going to help them come back, help them retain. And those users that are retained are going to be your greatest source of revenue. Repeated customers for us are our largest source of transaction volume by far. Like I said, the idea of recording everything sounds very nebulous, and I'll get into this a little bit more specific points in a second, but I want you to think about the data that your game is laying down. When you're building a game and you want to record the history of that game, I want you to think about it as a language that later on in your company's development and your game's life cycle, you can use the elements, the primitives of that language to ask better questions about the history of your game and the interactions of your users in that game. The more kinds of things that you store, the richer the vocabulary of that language is, the more discrete units of questions you can ask, if that makes sense. And why now? Why start when you're a small company? I'm hoping that most of you in the audience are relatively young startups, but you want to start recording this stuff as soon as possible, because the earlier you define this language, the longer, the richer the story, the deeper the story of your game will become, right? When later on, you're analyzing what made you succeed, what made you take off, and also what mistakes you made. And here's some ancient data warehousing hardware that I thought looked cool. This is what it used to take. So we're going to cover essentially 4 axes on which you can slice up the properties and the behaviors of your users in order to understand them. Essentially, you need to give each user a name by which you can reference them later. You need to have information to flesh out their characters. By that is to develop them. Who are they, right? You're going to drive the plot. The plot of the story of your game is the actions that they take, the behavioral data. And lastly, this doesn't fit in quite as well, but you need to balance the budget in that every game that is in every game that we're talking about today has an economy. It's not just tap and click. It's more like virtual currency transactions, at least in the games that we make. So when I'm saying that you're going to name your character, right, essentially means that for every user, you're going to want to have at least a unique identifier. You're going to want to know, keep track of what platforms they use, when they installed, where did you get them from, and if you're doing paid acquisition, you'll want to record how much they cost. These are essentially the basic units that you'll use to break down your user base. Some of our users play on Facebook, our apps, Lucky Slots, Lucky Bingo, etc. Facebook, iOS, Android, across several platforms. You want to know, because people don't just play on one, they play on 2. They play on different devices in different times of day, right? Recording all of these elements is going to give you a better chance to understand the way that they interact and the best time to message them, the best way to serve them. The when is very important, obviously. You're going to have different cohorts. You won't always be able to track exactly where your users came from. Understanding things like, oh, we got featured in some blog post or some article this week. Recording when they came into your app on the server side for later analysis will help you sort that out. It'll also allow you to track their behavior as they change. You know, if you have a player or a customer who stays with you for 6 months, 12 months, in social casino, sometimes we see 24-month user lifetimes. You need to know when they started, and being able to track them as they evolve within the game is very important. It leads to some really good insights. The where they came from, obviously this is easier with browser games than on the App Store, but there are technologies now for user attribution. I recommend them because the quality of users, whether they're people who discover your app organically on an App Store or in Facebook's App Center, or if you've bought them from Tapjoy or you bought them through some direct deal with another game developer, the performance can be very, very different. And of course, if you have this access to this information, you want to know for every user that you acquire how much they cost, so you can figure out if you're making any money on these guys. So that's the basics, right? That's one, think of that as one axis, right? Each one of these units that I'm going to talk about, the point of having a data warehouse is essentially that you can take each of these primitives and combine them with all of the others to ask almost any question about your game that you'd want, right? And we'll get to some examples later. The next axis that we think about our users beyond the platform and time of install and acquisition source is essentially socio-demographic, which Facebook is awesome for this. It's essentially the world's largest phone book, and many of your users already are on Facebook, and you can pull them in. For us, Facebook is the backbone of our multi-platform play. It's actually the Facebook ID that's the unique identifier that ties you in, whether you're playing on FB Canvas or on iOS or on Android. That's what allows you to have a shared balance. It's an identity mechanism, right? With that identity mechanism and well-placed or well-messaged prompts for richer user data in the Graph API, you can get their gender. You can get their age in physical years. You can get their age and game time off of your preceding by recording the install time. Location is important. What country? In the larger countries, certainly in the United States, we see a lot of differences in players between California and, let's say, West Virginia. In terms of helping your game to grow virally, from the Facebook API, you want to find friend density, which is essentially how many friends do they have and how often do they interact with them. As far as I know, Facebook is kind of the only game in town for this stuff. And also, finally, interest data. You can also pull their likes. So imagine that, like, you're trying to build a new feature to super serve a certain part of your customers, knowing all this information is going to be invaluable. If you know that they already like, I don't know, in the social casino arena, we have a lot of overlap with sort of solitaire card games and bridge and things like that. Maybe that's a theme that you'd want to explore for further content in your game. So, right, basic info in terms of identifying the users, socio-demographic data, action, behavioral data, right? Also called time series. This is essentially everything that every user ever does. And so with the unique ID that you acquire from Facebook, or rather you acquire in the first stage, and then you can tie in the demographic data from Facebook, can connect that to this behavioral data, which essentially, some examples you can say is like, how does the user, for every user you want to record how they engage with key features. So for us, we have explored in the last couple of years a lot of these sort of add-ons from social casino, right? You have your basic slot machine, okay, great, everybody can make a three-reel slot. But then do people want, the game players want additional meta features like collections or power-ups or boosts or the ability to lock reels, etc. You're going to have all these ideas for your game, right? And you're going to want to record every time every user interacts with that so that later on you can ask not just, did this feature do well? You can also ask, with whom did this feature do well, right? Like, it's an important difference. Playtime and frequency, what's their average session depth? You can track this very easily on mobile. On the web, it's a little more tricky, but there's plenty of third-party plugins with either Google Analytics, Mixpanel, et cetera, or you can write your own to track this. The frequency of play is often very interesting. Users who play once a day or once a week or several times a day, they're going to have very different play patterns. They're going to like different things, going to respond to different features. Naturally, purchase history, that one's pretty obvious. You may think that it's enough just to download the CSVs out of Google Play or iTunes or the Facebook reports. I recommend you do that, but you also supplement that by, at the time of every purchase, you record where they were in the game, as part of this general event log of your game history. It can be interesting to look back, right? When the user decides to buy something in the game, when they convert to a payer, look back at what they were doing before that. Sharing behavior, pretty straightforward. Who shares with whom and what. And finally, this can get kind of explosive in terms of its data requirements, but everything that's clickable or mouse overable, you probably want to record that too. Again, the purpose of this is to develop the most rich language you can in order to describe the behavior of your players in your game, so that later on you can ask questions, whether it's the question of, did this feature do well or why didn't it do well, right? All right, I saved this one for the last. It's actually the most tricky, is the economics of a game if you're running a free-to-play game with virtual currency. Economics are sort of a very difficult science no matter how you slice it, whether you're talking about the US budget or just your simple in-game economy. But really common practice is to give out bonuses, incentives, freebies for when you share or when you engage with a certain feature. You want to track that, understand how much free money you're giving away. Any game resource that you're going to have in your game, ours is fortunately relatively simple. We mostly have chips, but we actually do have one-time consumables. You're going to want to model these as money. It's essentially double ledger accounting. You want to have an entry for every time that a user purchases something, when something is credited to their account, whether it be coins or chips or tokens or whatever it is that you're selling, and also when they spend it. And you're going to want to keep that relatively tightly controlled, right? You want to make sure that's very, very accurate, because when you go to analyze it, discrepancies are going to, you're going to lose track of, you're going to lose trust in the data. If you have multiplayer features in your game, you're going to want to track currency flow between players. This not only helps with detecting cheaters, which I think are kind of overblown for the most part. It's usually a very, very tiny minority that's cheaters, but usually bugs, actually. Like, a lot of times you think that you may have some exploit, and it's actually just that you have some error in your code. But nonetheless, tracking the currency and the resources in your game at the economic level are going to allow you to ask the question later, is this a bug or is this just some malicious user? We've seen our share of both, whether Facebook or especially Android. There's a lot of hacks on Google Play. But yeah, the last point about the economics is essentially to take it really seriously. You know, these things that you're giving away for free or that you're tracking in your game, they do have a monetary value. Whether it's in terms of the player's time or in terms of the player's wallet, where they would have to actually buy the thing that you're tracking. You know, the more detailed and the more accurate your ledger is of transactions, the more likely it is that you're going to understand the success and failure of each feature. This is a picture in fall 2012. I think we had about 10 or 12 people we're just, I think, moving out of our first office. Pretty cool. We only had about 50 terabytes of data at that point. So I've been sort of trying to lay this down in terms of a semantic model. Essentially, that each of the 4 kinds of data that I've described, you're going to combine them in order to ask questions. They should make a language that you can use to interrogate the data that your warehouse, that your game has produced, in order to ask better questions, to make better decisions, and to build better products, right? So this is a good question. I called it the 100 question because it's something that you might ask at the very beginning of your company or your game's history, which is, does anybody like this game? Which is super broad, but it's something that we all wonder, right? Like, you have made something, it's launch day, and you're super nervous, and you hit the button to publish in iTunes Connect, and you're like, oh, sweet, let the users roll in. But it doesn't always happen that way, right? Let's refine that question, though. And if you're keeping all the data, you can ask a better question than does anyone like this game? You can ask, who likes this prototype of my game, right? We've found a number of different answers to this, but here's some hypotheticals. Maybe males 18 to 24 like your game, maybe people who are using late model 5 series iPhones like your game, or maybe users only in your home country like your game, right? If you're keeping the data along the axes that I mentioned, you'll be able to answer this because you'll have the user's age, their birth date from Facebook. You'll have the device model from their mobile device as they interact with your game, and you'll geolocate them, whether you do that with like an IPGeo database or use some API for it. Really straightforward, really easy. You know, keep it recorded on every event that goes into your data warehouse, and then you can answer these questions. And you can make a better decision from there. So you may find that if you were targeting males 18 to 24, then awesome, like you've done a perfect job, and you found product market fit, and it's time to go buy $2 million worth of users or something like that. Or not, or there may be more questions to ask. If you found that players only like it on late model iPhones, then the chances are that you have some performance issues, and you need to spend some time investing in optimizing on older model hardware. And if you're only succeeding in your home country, then the chances are you have to do some localization work. For us, that was really important. Lucky Slots on Facebook, I think, supports 55 languages. Mobile version, as I think, supports 12. And you'll find pockets of users that really love your app in different spots. Gotcha, 10 minutes. Lastly, in part of that is to collect emails and run surveys as part of your data warehouse. Especially when you're small, it can be really useful just to ask the question. Like if you have some question of your users, just run a survey and find out what the answer is. One-on-one question, slightly better. Assuming that anybody buys anything in your game, which can be very hard to find out very early on, you can ask what virtual goods are selling. But a better question is, what is selling to whom, right? Who's buying with the items in my game, right? Is it, and this was something that we found, that predominantly we had women buying virtual goods in our games. We found that there was a higher propensity to buy in the southern United States, and that users we got from Chartboost were really, really purchase happy. That was fantastic. With that information, you can make a better decision, essentially decide to buy either more or fewer users from a particular source. You can rechange the way that you message the in-app purchase dialogues and to target your sales. Once again, if you know where the user is, you can say things like, strange cold winter in Atlanta, Georgia this winter. Buy some extra chips because of it. Actually, I'm not a marketing guy, so that was terrible, but I think you get the point. And you also can create personalized SKUs, right? Special packages and upsells that users may enjoy. Right. This is a sort of another statement of the same question, so I won't go over it again, but this is along the axis of time, right? When you're recording every user that comes into your game and everything about them, especially when they install, then you'll understand your sales in terms of new players, people who have that sort of new Christmas morning feeling. Mid-game players, those are actually usually your core market. And the whales, the old folks, they don't like to buy very frequently, but when they do, they buy like $200 worth of stuff. With that information, you may decide that you need to explain what the SKUs are in your game, why they should buy them when they first arrive in your game. Or you may decide that your mid-game players are the most important and you're going to focus all of your engineering and art resources on it. And in terms of the later stage players, your whales that have been with your game for maybe 18 to 24 months, you're going to want to create events, live ops, markers of status, little badges, or community involvement. It's up to you, but hopefully if you collect all this stuff, you'll be able to make these decisions, because every game is different, and I can't tell you what to do. I can only tell you how to find out what to do for yourself. Payer conversion. This is sort of a 201 type question. Going back to time series data, if you're recording every event that happens in your game, you'll understand what people do before they buy, right? How many times does it take them to visit? How many play sessions do they need before they buy? Across cultures, are the buying behavior, or the conversion behaviors, are they different in France from the United States? Of course they are, right? And finally, UA source is another really important one. There's a lot of people selling users. Some of them are great, some of them aren't. Again, make a better decision. Add retention mechanisms. Increase the number of visits per week. If you find that your average buyer visits 7 times per week, find a way to get that person into your game 7 times a week. And across cultures, you can tailor these retention mechanisms to US, Europe, Asia, Latin America. Every culture is different. Some people respond better to frequent emails, some people don't, right? And there are generalizations you can draw across countries or geographical regions about this. And of course, obviously, if you find that some users aren't buying, stop buying users from whoever's selling you those users. So, this is the third, and there's only 4, so this is the next to last most sophisticated question, I think. And it also starts out high level. Is my game still fun? It's sort of a question you'll ask after maybe a year in operation, right? But if you restate that question, are my new players today engaging with the game features as much as their predecessors 6 months ago or 1 year ago, right? That's a more formulated question. That's a question you can answer with data. You can look around the marketplace. Is my user interface concurrent with my competitors? We all have competitors. You have to face them and keep your UI up to date. There are trends, right? And another good question to ask when you have a late stage game is, has it become too complex? Have we added too much to this game? And is it scaring away new users who come into the game today, right? If you super serve your whales and your middle-aged players, right, there's a real danger that you'll wind up with a game that just no one understands when they first install. So what can you do about this? I mean, you can essentially, if you're recording every click that people click in your app, you can essentially compare them against cohorts, your current cohort versus older installed cohorts, and see whether or not they click the same things. Did they discover the features in your app as quickly as their predecessors? You may decide that you want to have like an early new user mode where you hide half of the complexity of your game. This is also a really good idea. And then this is a little less clear, but you may want to also incentivize players to engage with the meta features of your game. If you have a core loop that is something like betting on a slot machine, but you also have collections and you also have friend bonuses to collaborate on, you may want to add this incentivization, just sort of to encourage your newer users to explore those features. Okay, this is a great one. And this is the last of the sort of question examples that I'm going to use. This is an economic question, and it's something that every game is going to face in its life cycle at some point, which is your performance may not be as good as it was last month. And you're going to, depending on where you are in the organization, you may be asking the question, or somebody may ask you, why is my revenue down, right? Start breaking that question down into its component parts. Who was paying? Why are they not paying today? Or why are they paying less than they were last month? We'll use the example here of why is whale revenue down? Why are your older customers who are spending large amounts of money in your game, why are they not doing that? There's a couple things that could be answers to this. In-game inflation is really scary. It's essentially, I think Diablo 3 faced it. Argentina has faced it. it's a very difficult problem. It essentially makes your players super rich, especially your whales, and they'll never have to give you another dollar, and they'll play for the rest of their life for free, right? The way you find this is essentially to track wallet balances, and if you're keeping track of every resource in your game that as it flows between players, as it flows from the game to the player, you'll be able to answer this question, right? There's also subsegments that you can look at. Maybe for whales, you typically don't have too many of them, so there may be a handful, and you'll really want to look at whether or not this is whales who have done a certain thing, or whales who are older, or whales who have just started playing, or whales in a particular geographic location. The better decision-making process is essentially that you'd use that ledger that you're keeping to find whatever part of your economy is out of balance. And it should be abundantly clear. Usually you can see millions of resources, whatever it is, flowing in a particular direction, and you can plug that hole. You plug the hole by introducing some sink for that resource, encourage the whales to spend on it, right? And within a month or two, depending on how aggressive you want to be with that sink, you're back to normal, you're golden. And if you find that it's specific subsegments of your whales that are that have experienced wallet inflation, you may want to have differentiated sinks. These may be special items or special packages targeted towards, whether it's players in Japan or players in Latin America or women, whatever it is. But it does work. Message them something specific, and they'll go for it. Yeah, obligatory cat. So that's sort of the end of the hypothetical questions and what you can do about it, and how you can use data in your data warehouse to answer these questions about your game. I did say I was going to talk a little bit about costs because as a bootstrap startup, we're always very conscious about spend. Here's some prices for some different technologies. Make it pretty quick, but MySQL is about $0.25 gigabyte. We use Hadoop now. It's about $0.10 a gigabyte. Keep in mind with MySQL, that's where we started. It's really cheap. You only need one cloud instance or something to run it, but as soon as you have maybe 5 or 10 terabytes, it's not going to work. You can also explain it in terms of a couple 100 million rows. But Hadoop, that has essentially infinite scalability, only bounded by your wallet. We went there after we thought we were going to have maybe 12 terabytes within 6 months or so, and so then we decided to make the switch. It's been really good to us. Ours is about $0.10 per gigabyte per month. You can get this even cheaper if you buy your own hardware. We don't. We rent it. And lastly, I wanted to mention Google Bigquery because I think it's super interesting. It's the cheapest on the block. I think you can get it down to 3 cents US per gigabyte. We tried it in 2011. It wasn't quite ready for prime time then, but I just looked at it recently and it looked like it's quite hot. So I'd recommend giving that a try if you're looking into this. And the other axis of cost is how much do I have, right? And at least for us, in year 0 and year 1, we had less than 5 terabytes, so we got away with just having one MySQL instance. When you have no users, it means you have no data. That's pretty easy. It doesn't mean you shouldn't keep it, though, because it's actually the most critical time to be asking these questions. As soon as you have something that takes off, it's going to grow pretty rapidly. 2 years in, we had 50 terabytes of data, and we kind of had to scramble in order to get something up to contain it. And then now we have greater than 100 terabytes, and we expect that to double once a year, depending on product launches and stuff like that. And that's the head count now in a swanky office in San Francisco. And seriously, it was essentially data that got us here. The last point I want to make about this too is that there's a lot of things to do when you're starting your game company, not least of which is keeping all these people happy. And so you want to set up all these data warehousing techniques and products early so that you can forget about it and concentrate on the fun part of running a games company, which is essentially taking care of your people and building better products. And that's pretty much it. We're hiring for all roles.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Any questions?
Maybe I've got a couple of questions. So all the things you've talked about here are when you're online. Do you have any technologies or solutions for when you're playing offline and then uploading all that clickstream later?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a bunch of stuff out there. We use a technology from LinkedIn called Kafka. It's essentially a queuing mechanism, and then you can actually run that on the mobile client. There's libraries that you can embed into either your Android or iOS app, which will essentially spool it to the device and then sync it up to the server. Even if the device has been offline for any amount of time, when the the data is synced back up to your data warehouse. It'll get automatically filed into each individual bucket depending on what day that event was generated, right? So you don't have to be online. You can essentially use the local device as a cache and then sync it up later.
Next question. Fraud prevention or people scripting it, script kiddies going through, what do you do to try and weed out the data that shouldn't be there?
That's like dead easy. Actually, the data is half the part of catching the fraud and the script kiddies. I mean, you're going to find things like somebody in Uzbekistan making, you know, $300 purchases, and they're all have the API signature of something called IAP cracker, right? And it's going to be totally obvious, right? And if you're keeping this information, you'll know to what degree fraud is a problem in your economy. So.
Other questions? I can keep going with questions.
Audience questions?
Okay, let me talk about privacy. You're capturing all this data. Some of it's pseudonymous, anonymous data.
Right.
Different countries have different requirements for how long you take it before you anonymize it. What are your principles for how you anonymize or pseudonymize data after you've had it for a while?
Yeah, that's a good question. So anonymizing the data essentially just removes any personally identifiable tracker, which means that if you sort of replace something like an email address or a Facebook ID with a one-way hash, you're in good shape. And that's pretty much it.
These questions.
Hi. Do you keep all the raw data indefinitely? And which tools do you use to analyze the data? Because I see you keep quite a lot, and we do too.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a number. Yeah, we do keep it indefinitely. Obviously, the older the data is, it has sort of some element of bit rot. There's bugs in your code that are going to do weird things. Hopefully, a good analyst will be able to weed those things out. We use predominantly Hadoop technologies. So that means Hive, Impala, and Presto. Presto is pretty cool. It's new from Facebook. It's exciting. Shout out. So Hive has percentile functions where you can do queries and essentially only look at, let's say, up to the 95th percentile of something, right? And that will help you weed out outliers and fraud and things like that. I think that was what you're asking. Is there another part to it?
No.
Okay.
That's okay. Thank you.
Any other audience questions? Oh.
You just mentioned that if the game is being enjoyed and appreciated in just one region, maybe there is a point in localizing it for other regions. I'm interested in your opinion. What about Ukrainian games about current political events? Do they have a chance abroad if they're somehow localized?
That goes beyond localization. That's like culturalization, which is essentially like to replace things that would be relevant to your home culture to those that are going to translate well to another culture. So, for example, if you're making free viral apps and stuff like that in the U.S., it's really great to make like an Obamacare app potentially. I wouldn't try that internationally. It's a tough call. We haven't done too much of the deep cultural localization just because you know, if we were going to do that, we would probably hire somebody who was a native from the country that we were going to enter.
Okay, well, last question, 2 minutes.
So obviously you're very driven, sort of data-driven. Are there any product decisions that you felt like data is not going to help us here, or it's in a way slow us down, we just need to do it, or act by hunch, like areas where data is not really the solution for you?
Oh, totally. I mean, data only tells you about the past. I mean, it's not quite the same thing to predict the future. There are some, I forgot to actually mention this, but keeping your data from the very beginning allows you, as time goes on, to get access to more sophisticated algorithms, such as payer prediction through lookalike analysis and stuff like that. But ultimately, the point of this is that this is a language that you're defining to describe the history of your game, the story of your game, right? It's up to you to write that in terms of where that goes. It's not going to tell you what to do, but you're still in the driver's seat. But it is really great to have an imaginary friend in your data warehouse that you can ask anything about any part of any player and of any time. So it's not a substitute for intuition, but it makes a great tool for somebody who's analytically minded and has some intuition.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dave. Awesome. And you'll be around afterwards to answer any questions.